You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Join me as we uncover the rich histories of North America's Great Plains, exploring the latest archaeological discoveries and past cultures that shape this storied region. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to episode 1 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I'm your host, Professor Carlton Shilchief-Gover, and I am just absolutely thrilled to have you join me on this exciting journey through the rich and fascinating histories of North America's Great Plains. So, as we kick off this podcast, we're going to take the first few episodes to dive into the background of the Great Plains archaeological region. And I want to do that just so we can set the stage for what kind of flora, fauna, and geologic and geographic features we can expect as we talk about sites and concepts later in the series. We will always have these episodes up front that you can go back to maybe more familiarize yourself with some of the larger things going on, right? So you're just going to have to bear. We're going to have to bear with it together. Let me do that. We're going to have to bear through this together as we navigate at this show. And I do want to mention there's the audio portion of this podcast available wherever you guys get your podcasts at, as well as the Archaeology Podcast Network. Additionally, there is a video component to this podcast, which is available on the Archaeology Podcast Network channel on YouTube. So it will be captioned. So if you have any friends, colleagues, family that are deaf or deaf plus, they can go to the YouTube show and see the captions that will have transcribed of. So this is accessible to a broader audience, and the YouTube version is a little less edited. So a lot of my stutters, or if I have to redo something, it'll be available. So it'll kind of have like the built-in bloopers. But anyways, I just want to get right to it. So today on episode 1, we're going to explore and talk about the geography of the Great Plains. So really, for the purpose of this first episode, right, we're going to be talking about geography. We're going to be talking about the landscapes, the flora and fauna that exist, especially during the Holocene. So that is the geologic epoch, I guess, that we are in today. And when we talk about the Ice Age or the archaeology further in the past, we'll contextualize what the Great Plains would have looked like then. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So I do want to mention the source material for today's episode really comes from, and for those that aren't watching on YouTube, I'm holding up Dr. Doug Bamforth's book, especially The Archaeology of the North American Great Plains by Douglas Bamforth from the University of Colorado, Boulder, my dissertation advisor and mentor. So this volume came out in 2021, solo authored. It's all Doug throughout the whole book. This is what I used to teach with for my Great Plains Archaeology and Anthropology classes, which are also modeled off of how he taught the classes. So, just the caveat, a lot of this show really does come from the mentorship of Dr. Doug Bamforth, as well as others of my colleagues from the Plains Anthropological Society in the Great Plains region. So a lot of what we're talking about today is coming from Doug's book, as well as I think another great resource to learn about Great Plains geography and some background information is, of course, Archaeology of the Great Plains. This came out in like 1998, so it's a little dated, but like some of the first chapters about like the Great Plains setting, phenomenal resources. So this is Archaeology of the Great Plains, edited by Ray Wood, and it is an edited volume. So each chapter has different contributors. So really, these two books, Archaeology in the North American Great Plains and Archaeology on the Great Plains, absolutely must-haves for anybody who is interested. Move my mic a little bit. Interested in Great Plains archaeology. Additionally, another one that I've been reading recently, again, that I like, People in a Sea of Grass. This is edited by Matt E. Hill and Lauren Ritterbush. This also came out recently, I think 2001, a lot of Central Plains stuff. But in terms of like what's nice about geography and background, right? It doesn't really change no matter the volume or the paper. So, I mean, even though these, especially the Ray Wood volume is a bit older, the Great Plains has remained the Great Plains. So where are the Great Plains, right? So like just to set the tone, what are we looking at in terms of where is this place, right? So the Great Plains region, many of us have a concept that it is flat and boring, and we'll investigate that together, fellow listeners. So just a couple to list, a number of states and Canadian provinces in which have Great Plains regions. First we have Alberta, we have Saskatchewan, a bit of Manitoba, like the southwest portion of Manitoba is Great Plains, Montana, North Dakota, eastern Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska, eastern Colorado, like basically the Front Range over to Nebraska and Kansas. And then we get Kansas, right? Eastern New Mexico, Oklahoma, and then Texas. Now, this is the Great Plains region, and it is very much a north to south axis, that it is really long. And it is the crossroads for cultures from the Great Plains, or sorry, not Great Plains, my bad. I meant to say Great Lakes. The crossroads between the Great Lakes, the Southwest, the Southeast, the Rocky Mountain region, right? So in order for individuals, cultures, and societies to interact with each other on the other side of the continent, they have to go through the Great Plains. And we'll get to that a bit later. Now, there is the Prairie Peninsula, and we'll talk about prairies here in a moment. And there's states like Illinois and Indiana and parts of Minnesota. They have the Prairie Peninsula that goes through them, but they're not Great Plains region. So they do have prairie, but prairie doesn't necessarily equate to the Great Plains. So for those that might have heard, well, there's prairie where I live outside of Indiana, like, yeah, that's great, but that's not Great Plains. So cool. Now, that's a lot of land mass to cover, right? That is many different states with different climates, different animals, different ecosystems. So the way archaeologists and anthropologists have divided the Great Plains, we have 5 primary geographic divisions that kind of set the tone for this is the part of the Great Plains that I study. And the first one is being the Northwest Plains. The Northwest Plains, those are Canadian provinces. So Saskatchewan, Alberta, as well as the eastern halves. Basically anything that's not mountains from Wyoming and Montana, their eastern border to where you begin to go uphill in mountains, that's the Northwest Plains. Then we have the Northeastern Plains. So that is Manitoba, North Dakota, and South Dakota. All right, so that's our Northeastern Plains sub-region. So the entire states of North Dakota, South Dakota, and then basically up to Winnipeg in Canada, that area, and southeastern Saskatchewan. Then we have the Central Plains. Through this podcast, right, I'm a Central Plains archaeologist. I will talk a lot about the Central Plains in this show. In the Central Plains, this is Nebraska, Kansas, eastern Colorado, basically Denver to Nebraska and Kansas. We also get northwestern Missouri and western Iowa in this region, just on the opposite side of the Missouri River from Nebraska and Kansas. This gets captured into the Central Plains region. Then we have the Southern Plains, and Southern Plains is Oklahoma, Texas, and eastern New Mexico. That is our Southern Plains region. And if you're following along and catching on, I've already named like all the states and regions, and we're only at 4 geographic divisions, right? So what's the fifth? And the fifth is very specific. It's like a sub-region within the Northern Plains, and that is what we call the Middle Missouri region. So this is archaeology along the Missouri River in North and South Dakota. So basically, once the Missouri River hits Sioux City, Iowa, the middle Missouri region ends. So a lot of stuff happens in this region in North and South Dakota along the Missouri River, which really kind of demanded it having its own subset. Because what's going on in the Missouri River up here in this region, in this northeast region of the plains, is very different from what's going on outside of there. That the middle Missouri has its own region within the Great Plains. Uh, so yeah, those are regions. So throughout this show, right, we're going to talk about when we talk about sites, I will say, oh yeah, so this is in this region of the Great Plains. And so now you have that concept of where we are. So, once again, we're just kind of doing the background. This is like week 1 of Archaeology of the Great Plains lecture, right? Where everyone's just getting settled in from coming back from break or coming into school for the first time. So we're setting the stage. So, like I said, not every episode is going to be like this, but especially at the beginning of the show, as we get started, we're doing the background right now, everybody. Like the point of this is we're gonna learn about the Great Plains together. And the Great Plains is known for being grassland, right? We think of the Great Plains as a sea of grass, but there is variation in Great Plains grasslands. And I apologize for those on video. You're seeing me like move my hand around. I need a USB-A to USB-C adapter to hook up my camera so we can get a better angle. So right now, our IT guy at KU's gone, so I'm like using my laptop camera, and I have all my notes on my laptop. So as like I'm speaking, you might be hearing clicking. That's me like trying to rush with my hands up, trying to pull up my notes so I can stay on topic. So, when we talk about the grasslands and we talk about vegetation, the big thing is climate controls vegetation. And subsequently, vegetation controls animals, and more importantly, controls agricultural potential. So these are all very critical, right? Climate dictates vegetation, and vegetation dictates what animals can sustain themselves in a region. And then also subsequently, when humans bring agriculture, specifically like maize-based agriculture to the Great Plains, what's going to be most profitable to a maize-based economy. So the Great Plains not only is a crossroads in North American regions for people interacting and trading and exchanging ideas and goods with another, it's also the crossroads of many different kinds of climatic conditions. So like to the north, we have continental polar air, which is dry, cold and dry. Just to the south in Mexico, we have the continental tropic, which is hot and dry. To the east, we have maritime polar, which is cold, moist. So like a lot of different weather patterns that create the climate, right? That's what the climate is. They're all mixing here. So there's a lot of different environmental factors that are shaping the environment. And as such, the mean annual precipitation of this region is varied. It is wetter the more east you go on the Great Plains, specifically the more southeast you go, and it is you get less precipitation the more west you go, right? So think of the difference, like same time of year in July. Do you want to be in eastern Kansas, or do you want to be in eastern New Mexico, right? Do you want to be in northern Montana, or do you want to be in southwest Texas, right? So because we do have this longitude focus with the Great Plains. It is long north to south. It is longer than it is wide. The Great Plains is hot dog style. It's very susceptible to latitudes and changes in latitude, but there is substantial difference going east to west and west to east, right? Because the Great Plains on the west is bordered by the mountains. You are going up in elevation the further west you go. If you've ever taken a cross-country trip, you burn more gas going to Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming, Montana than you do coming back down towards the Missouri River or Mississippi because of that increase in elevation. So there's that east to west dynamic. And, we get seasonality in the Great Plains, right? And seasonality means you get more precipitation, more mean precipitation, average precipitation in warmer seasons, right? So like summer and spring. And with that, we're going to stop talking about rain, and we are going to take a quick break on episode 1 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast, and we'll be right back. And we're going to talk more about Rachel, Chris, edit this part as I pull up the next part of my PowerPoint. And we're going to talk more about grass. We're going to talk about grass and animals. Exciting stuff, exhilarating stuff. So we'll be right back after these sweet, sweet messages from the Archaeology Podcast Network and its affiliates. Stay tuned. Welcome back to episode 1 of the Archaeology of the Great Plains podcast. I'm still your host, Carlton Shield Chief Gover, professor at the University of Kansas. And we're going to talk about grass now, everybody. We're getting into grasses, right? So we know the Great Plains is grasses. And just to like real quick go over it, right? We have 3 different kinds of grasslands that exist on the plain. And these are important for human behavior. And when we get to the archaeological record, what is dictating and determining from an environmental standpoint where people are choosing to live. To the east, the closer you get to the Missouri River and on the Missouri River, right? That is your tall grass prairie. So it is a bit more arboreal. There's more trees. The grasses are taller. There is more vegetation production in this region. The further west you go, so really we're talking about like central Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, North and South Dakota. As we're getting towards the mountains, right? We're getting away from the Missouri River to the east. We're heading towards the mountains. And in the center of these Midwest states, Nebraska and Kansas in particular, this is our mixed grass prairie. This is the stereotypical, little house on the prairie environment. It is both a mix of, as the name suggests, your tall grasses and your short grasses. And then you get to the short grass steppe, like along the Rocky Mountain Front Range. This is where your like buffalo grass is. This is where grass is, ankle height, maybe shin height, whereas mixed grass, we're talking about your knee height, and then tall grass further to the east, your hips and shoulders, right? So this is our short grass steppe. So this is the when we think cowboys and Indians, we think of like 1800s, late 1800s, Indian wars where the Lakotas, Cheyennes, and Arapahoes are the focal point against the U.S. cavalry. And they're, out in Colorado and Wyoming. These are the kind of environments we're talking about. So the short grass prairie steppe. But there's more than just grass, okay, in the Great Plains. Like there are trees. They do exist. I've seen them. It's not like Iceland, especially the closer you get to water systems, right? And I know this might, for many of our listeners, you're thinking, okay, where the hell are we going with this? Of course, there's trees. But in terms of how environment dictates, or not dictates, that's always bad. That sounds like environmental determinism. As far as how the environment does impact human decisions and human behavior, right? We do have trees in the area, which are important for making tools, right? So handles and staves for bows, atlatls, like wood is important. And especially in this region, especially in like the southeast kind of Great Plains, we get Osage orange, which is a very incredible wood for bow making. So we have a lot of that. The closer you get to water, the more dense vegetation is going to be, the more agricultural output you're going to have, as well as that's where the location of trees. And the height of the grass, right? Why do we have short grass prairie to the west, tall grass prairie to the east? Well, that's dictated by precipitation, right? It is wetter the further you go to the east. It is drier the further you go to the west, right? So this local variation in grasses is very much dependent on local variation in precipitation. So, but there's not a standard way to do this, like the Nebraska Sandhills, which is in northwestern Nebraska. So where do you expect to be a dry environment? There's the Nebraska Sandhills, which are a natural aquifer, which make it less dry than the surrounding areas, like it is an oasis within western Nebraska. And we also see, more drought-like areas in other parts of Nebraska, Kansas, and South Dakota that are drier than the surrounding area. So even though there is a theme, the further east you go in the Great Plains, the closer you get to the Missouri River, the wetter it's going to be. There are exceptions to the rule, like everything else. in life. But the Great Plains is also known for like hazards, tornadoes, of course, drought. We can think of the Dust Bowl, but tornadoes are a big feature. And we'll talk about tornadoes in particular in a future episode as we talk about architecture in the Great Plains and how people are choosing architectural styles. So like stay tuned for that. And of course, like where do we find tornadoes? They're huge in the Great Plains. The Oklahoma is the big spot. That is the average number. But then like Kansas and Nebraska are also big indicators for tornadoes. So keep that in mind. This is tornado country. Canada, not so much, but the Central Plains and the Southern Plains, that is tornado country. Floods are also a big part of Great Plains lifeways, especially on the Missouri River and its tributaries. It does flood. And we will talk about floods as we will talk about tornadoes and how people choose where to live once we get to that point. So, yes, this sounds silly, but this first episode on the background is contextualizing what we're going to see in the archaeological record as people respond to environmental factors. We also get insects, fires, another big one. And just to kind of like summarize what we are seeing in terms of climate and vegetation, right? Um, it varies systemically. You have more precipitation, more foraging potential to the east, less to the west, and you get hotter, more sparser, more unpredictable plant growth to the south, um, and less to the north. So, right, the further north you go, generally the cooler it's going to be. The further east you go, the more wetter it's going to be. So, where we are, what subregion in the plains will have different environmental factors. But topography, right? We're kind of closing out the environment, but now we're going to talk about like more geographic features on the plains. Topography, everyone thinks of the Great Plains as flat. It's not flat. Um, it's dictated by negative erosion topography, right? So the topography on the Great Plains is very much driven by rivers. So, and they're hidden. That's the cool part. Is like if you ever really walk the landscape, like canyons appear out of nowhere that you wouldn't see before. So like these river systems carving through the Great Plains are dictating the kind of topography that we have. And our major rivers on the plains, what are we talking about? And they'll come up a lot. We have the North Saskatchewan River. The Missouri is a huge one. The Platte, Nebraska, Republican in southern Nebraska, northern Kansas, the Smoky Hill in Kansas, the Arkansas in Kansas, and then it leads into Oklahoma. The Canadian River, which goes into the Texas, the northern Texas, and into Oklahoma, and the Red River, and the Pecos. Right. We also know the big part of these rivers, right? The Missouri is awesome and it's huge. In the plains in general, rivers are not necessarily deep, but they are wide. And in Nebraska, like the Loup, Republican, Niobrara, these rivers are filled with sand. Like you can go through some of Lewis and Clark's original journals, and they're just not navigable. They are very difficult to watercraft. So that's why they kept going up the Missouri, right? So even the rivers pose a challenge. But we also have, physiographic features on the Great Plains that stand out, that a lot of folks and cultures in the past, refer to. We have Cypress Hills in Canada, in the High Plains region, right up in western Nebraska, Kansas, and Texas. We have the Black Hills in South Dakota, the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming, the Nebraska Sand Hills, which I mentioned before, the Flint Hills in Kansas, Llano Escado in Texas, and the Arbuckle Mountains in Oklahoma. So, like, we do have positive topography, right, in these areas. This place isn't just completely flat, and that kind of goes with when we look at the Bighorns or the Black Hills. that change in elevation, the topography, this positive topography, is creating environmental ecosystems that are unlike what's in the rest of the Great Plains. A lot more trees. It's a little bit wetter, and so there's access to different, environmental and animal resources that we have to keep in mind. And with that, right, another major thread or lines of thread that interweave into this tapestry of the Great Plains is locations and major sources of flakable stone. Like, where are people getting their raw materials to make tools out of? And there's a number of places on the Great Plains that become centers of human activity throughout, over 15,000 years people have been here. You get Knife River Flint from North Dakota. We have the White Chalcedony group, which is in South Dakota, eastern Wyoming, northeastern Colorado, Smoky Hill Jasper in Nebraska and Kansas, Flint Hill and Florence A. Chert out of Kansas, Burlington Chert out of western Iowa, Alabates, Agate, Tecovas, Jasper, and Edwards Plateau Chert, all coming from Texas. So, like, from a north to south axis, they're major centers of raw material collection areas that people will continually visit over time, right? So even though there's not necessarily, we do have even though we do have limited positive topography on the Great Plains, there's still access to rocks that people need in order to make stone tools, right? So Chris, Rachel, I want you to tie this up with the last complete sentence I made. Additionally, even though we have these major sources of stone tool material, there is definitely surface exposure of secondary stone on eroded ridges, as well as deposits of cobbles made by glaciers during the last ice age. So even though we have our major sources of exposed stone tool material of cherts, chalcedonies, flints, jaspers, what have you, there are other areas in which people can procure stone tool material on the Great Plains. Rivers, of course, are a huge one. And that's a lot to go through, right? In a 30-minute podcast episode, we really did like a crash course into the geography and climate of the Great Plains, right? So those are kind of the two big things of the takeaway is like, what are the Great Plains? How are they subdivided? What is the environment like? What kind of resources do people have access to? Because all these things shape human behavior and human culture as we go through time, right? So I thought this episode was very important. And so what's going to happen here on the next episode, we're really going to start looking into the flora and fauna of the Great Plains, right? So we're going to keep setting the stage for humans, and I appreciate you guys bearing with me as we go through the show. So these are just the background episodes. We will get into archaeology very, very soon. So with that, thank you for joining me for episode 1 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I cannot wait to explore the mysteries of the Great Plains with you. Our next episode will dive into the flora and fauna of the Great Plains. But until then, dear listeners, keep your curiosity alive and your mind open to the stories waiting to be discovered beneath the prairie. I'll see you all next time. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Pawnee_archaeologist, and you can also email me at greatplainsarchpodcast@gmail.com. And remember, anybody can love the mountains, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. American author Willa Cather.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.